You've read the title. Paul Ehrlich wanted to poison the water supply.
This is where we make the medicine.
But let's take a step back. Who is Paul Ehrlich? He's a professor of biology at Stanford University. In 1968, he wrote a book called The Population Bomb, which was a global phenomena, and it propelled him to be a thought leader among environmentalists who thought that the world was going to end because of overpopulation. So he's objectively well educated and very smart, but I don't find his arguments regarding overpopulation to be very compelling anymore. And I made a video talking about why I don't find those arguments compelling. The shortest version of why I don't find him compelling is that we've been putting his theories to the test for 50 years, and he's been wrong again and 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 again. While I wanted to focus on the meat of his arguments about what the problem was in the other video, I was slowly exposed to the madness that is the things this man says, so my wife demanded that I make this video. She calls it the fun one. In the last video, I laid out many of his false predictions. He said that England most likely wouldn't exist in the year 2000. He said that by 1980, all major life in the sea would be extinct. He said that India would never be able to create enough food to support itself. He claimed that hundreds of thousands of people would die from smog disasters. He claimed that life expectancy was declining and would stabilize at 42 by 1980. He claimed that 90% of tropical forests would be gone by 2005. But here, I really want to focus on some of the bonkers solutions to overpopulation that he proposed. So, mentioned it already, he wanted to poison the water supply. More specifically, he wanted to put sterilizing agents in the water supply so nobody could have children unless they get an antidote that the government would selectively hand out. He pointed out that such a drug doesn't exist yet, but a colleague of his at Stanford said that there was such a thing that we could develop. And Paul Ehrlich ultimately said, well, as long as there's a chance it has major side effects, we shouldn't do it. But that means that if we could prove that it didn't have substantial side effects, he would be more than happy to sterilize most of the population and give government the control over who gets to and does not get to have a child. In fact, he argued that this was a more ethical population control measure than a lot of economic pressures, which he also proposed doing and more directly supported in his time. In particular, he suggested putting a sin tax on a lot of baby stuff, like cribs and diapers. This is one of the only things I've ever seen him kind of regretting. In his later work, he puts a much heavier emphasis on the fact that rich people are the problem, and so we shouldn't be making policies that disproportionately hurt poor people. And of course, putting a sin tax on baby stuff, like cribs and diapers, would price a lot of poor people out of the market for children. So it is kind of an about face he made, although he certainly didn't say that he was wrong to have proposed those policies, only that he wished he focused on rich people being the problem more. Another wild thing he suggested was that we should just let India starve to death. He said that there's no way India will ever be able to feed itself, and so we shouldn't be giving them food aid. We should reserve our food aid for people who we can actually save. This is particularly nuts because India can now feed themselves. And so had we taken Paul Ehrlich's advice and stopped providing India with food aid, it would have caused famines similar to the ones that he was worried would happen. Paul's tried to defend himself a number of times in interviews. Most recently in 2018, he was asked pointedly if he regrets that his views were used to support coercive policies from governments. And he said, no, fundamentally, people will twist your words and take it out of context. But he felt pretty comfortable because he'd never supported any coercive policies. That's a lie. I can't take it any other way. I can't imagine he doesn't think some of the policies he's once supported were coercive. He wrote a textbook in the 70s called Ecoscience, Population, Resources, Environment, and on page 786, we get this gem. In this section of the book, he's arguing that we should reshape society to not have a positive opinion of having more children, and we should encourage people to be more responsible about bringing children into the world. And as an extension of that, children born outside of marriage, which he calls illegitimate children, we should strongly discourage people from bearing them. In particular, he says, One way to carry out this disapproval might be to insist that all illegitimate babies be put up for adoption, especially those born to minors, who generally are not capable of caring properly for a child alone. If a single mother really wanted to keep her baby, she might be obliged to go through adoption proceedings and demonstrate her ability to support and care for it. Adoption proceedings probably should remain more difficult for single parents than for married couples, in recognition of the relative difficulty of raising children alone. It would even be possible to require pregnant single women to marry or have abortions, perhaps as an alternative to placement for adoption, depending on the society. Somewhat more oppressive measures for discouraging large families have also been proposed, such as assigning public housing without regard for family size and removing dependency allowances from student grants or military pay. Some of these have been implemented in crowded Singapore, whose population program has been counted as one of the most successful. Wild! That's a wild thing to say. I've never supported coercive policies. I have, however, supported forcing children of single mothers to be up for adoption, aborted, or compelling their mothers to get married. Nuts is nuts. 50 years ago, he wrote this. He's never recanted. He's never said he's sorry. He's never turned back on this. And he got a 60 Minutes interview in 2023. Wild. Also wild, in that same book, this was in a section about socioeconomic policies. Immediately after this was a section titled Involuntary Fertility Control. In that section, he discusses the sterilization agent in the water supply, and he also defends India's policy of coercive sterilization. He specifically said, there is too little time left to experiment further with educational programs and hope that social change will generate a spontaneous fertility decline, and most of the Indian population is too poor for direct economic pressures to be effective. He then suggests that instead of India's proposed program of sterilizing men after they had their third child, that they might instead look at sterilizing women after having their second child, because while sterilizing procedures for women are more difficult surgeries than vasectomies, if you do it as part of a birth, it's not more difficult, and this would be viable in any society where most children are born through medical assistance. To be clear, India's government was doing a lot of coercive things to increase sterilization. Government employees were refused pay until they showed a certificate of sterilization. Healthcare was denied to the unsterilized. Poor people were rounded up and brought to vasectomy camps. Those camps were so unhygienic and follow-ups were not conducted, leading to an unknown number of deaths. But we do know that thousands of Indians filed for wrongful death claims in connection with these camps. And these are the policies that he's defending in his 1977 textbook. Once again, he's never apologized. He's never said that this was a mistake. He's never said that he has regrets for the thousands of people that directly died from the things that he defended. And once again, 60 Minutes gave him an interview in 2023. He was the first 60 Minutes interview of 2023. They started with Paul Ehrlich. That's a lot of crazy. We're not really going to get anything that's more crazy than that, but I want to put out two more crazy statements of his to sort of show what I think was really wrong with him and why he thinks this way. He wrote an article in 1975 where he said, those who believe that science will pull a technological rabbit out of the hat to save us at the last minute simply suffer from an inability to learn. Technological rabbits tend to create more problems than they solve. They usually have large appetites and abundant, noxious droppings. The Green Revolution, broadcast use of antibiotics, and chlorinated hydrocarbon pesticides, dependence on the automobile for personal transportation, and nuclear power are prime examples. This is a wild statement. The Green Revolution was a series of dramatic improvements to agriculture, which saved, estimates are, about 1 billion lives. He thinks that was a bad thing. Notably, the people that he thought were going to starve to death by the hundreds of millions in the 1970s were saved because of the Green Revolution. He didn't want them to be saved, which is weird. He doesn't explain why he doesn't think those billion people should have been saved by the Green Revolution, what the downsides are that are so dramatic as to justify saying that it was a mistake. But I do have a suspicion that's sharpened by another one of his statements in that article. The essay is focused on nuclear energy, and he says, for the sake of argument, let's assume that nuclear energy is developed to the point where there's almost zero direct costs, economically and environmentally. And then let's say that these power plants are dotted across the whole world. So at that point, all of mankind has access to abundant, cheap, and clean power. What happens then? Possibly the end of civilization. What? That's the game. Even if we stopped emitting greenhouse gases, even if we stopped using fossil fuels altogether, even if we dramatically reduced the land usage for energy production, Paul still wouldn't support humans having access to abundant, cheap power. Because he thinks if humans have abundant, cheap power, we'd use it to destroy the world. Fundamentally, he thinks humans make more problems than we solve. So he would rather people die than solve their problems. He's on Team Nature, and he sees humanity as the enemy. So if you're human, he's an enemy to you and me. He's poison ivy. I think that's enough. I've made other videos talking about Paul Ehrlich, both as the real-world inspiration for MCU Thanos and addressing his arguments more directly about why overpopulation is a problem. If those interest you, they should be here. But before you go watch those, please like, share, and subscribe. Thank you for listening. Bye.